Hey woodworkers. So today I want to talk about the importance of choosing the right tools for laying out joinery, and that brings us to marking tools in some capacity. So I know a lot of woodworkers have been very okay with a number two, standard number two pencil. These are great, and they do a job of creating a location. So we can draw a line there, and that's good. The problem that I think you run into with something like this is that the more you use this tool, the quality of this line, or more specifically the accuracy of this line, starts to degrade. It starts to get wider and wider and wider the further down this pencil you go. No matter how much I sharpen it, it's only going to be so fine. The other thing is that it's a good visual representation of where it is I want to be, but not a physical representation. And that'll make sense here in a second when we start talking about cutting tools. The next step would be a mechanical pencil, and big difference between these two here. Probably from where you're viewing you can't see the difference, but to my eye this is the first line with the number 2 is much larger than the mechanical pencil. And so I'm getting closer to accuracy, but I'm not fully there yet. So transitioning into making the most accurate lines possible, we need to start talking about how to actually sever the fibers or make a physical imprint into the material of where it is I want to be. And so I have a couple of examples of marking knives that I have used for years, and there's no real reason for me to go back from these. They're fairly well beaten up, battle scarred and all that, but really fantastic tools. What you're looking at now is an old jointer knife that I've ground down the sharp edge, and then I've also introduced 2 new cutting edges. The nature of a marking knife, I think, is important. Sometimes they sell these as either right-handed or left-handed, and by right-handed marking knives they would have a bevel that extends all the way up and then the back, so your cutting edge is way out here. That's fine, has a single bevel, a flat back, much like a chisel would, or a hand plane blade. The problem with this is that now I need to have 2 of these tools, one for using my right hand and one for the left, and it just seems crazy to have more than one of these things. So as long as this bevel is being created to less than 45 degrees, I should be able to get into most areas where I would need to mark things out. Thinking of dovetails or mortise and tenons, which is what we're going to do here in a second. This tool is pretty great. Another option, also homemade. This is an old bandsaw blade, so you see some flexibility into this one. A much thinner blade, but the geometry is the same, 45 degrees or less. 2 bevels and a flat back here, and I can use this to start marking out dimensions. Because this is far less comfortable to hold than the thicker marking, the thicker jointer knife, I've epoxied and cut out a section to recess in to accept the bandsaw blade, and then just kind of shaped this wood around it. And this is something that I'm very comfortable to hold. It gives me good control. The thing I always like to tell my students is that I was very proud of myself for making these things just to prove that I can, which is great because there's this whole process of making sure you don't lose the temper when you grind these things down, and so it's this real slow process. So it took me hours to make these things, and then several hours in addition to really sharpen and chew these things up. And I could have easily bought one of these things from any catalog or woodworker supply place for $20 or so, and they're a great tool. So, alright, in marking these things out, I have a square here. I always prefer adjustable blade squares, and I'll talk about that here in a second, but say I want to make a mark there. I would set the back of this marking knife towards the blade of the chisel, or of the square, pardon me. If I were to wrap this around, there's no real reference, and this knife is going to start having a mind of its own. But landing this to a specific location, holding the square nice and tight into the edge of the board, I can drag this thing across. Now you might not be able to pick up what that one looks like from the camera, but unlike finding a pencil line, I can drag this thing over and there's no real physical indent or impression into the board. But with this marking knife, you find it right away and you'll know exactly when you're the place you want to be, which makes accuracy that much easier. Once you can feel these things from careful, accurate layout, then life gets so much better. Okay, so let me mark something out here quickly. Alright, let's say I want to make you 1.5 inches, so that's great. So now that I have that little mark there, I can come back to it, finding it, bringing my square up to it. So now I have lines. I got into the habit years ago because depending on where you're working, finding those lines can be problematic. So I was coming with my mechanical pencil and really highlight these sections. And in doing so, it makes it so much easier, regardless of the lighting conditions that you have, to just have more accuracy. Another thing that I wanted to show, this might be easier with a smaller square, is that whenever I'm marking out for joinery, I want to transfer this to both faces of the material. So I'm making little notches on the corners, and that will allow me, I can feel that there, making another notch here on the corner. So flipping this thing around, you'll notice that when I was carrying these things over, I was using my reference edge. I made some marks here, my original reference face, reference edge, but I always want to keep my square on that reference. If for any reason at all this other edge is not truly parallel to that first edge, then you can imagine that your layout lines are going to be all kinds of inaccurate. So anyway, keeping my square here when I was drawing it around, carrying it around, and then back through the other face. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Notice I have a bunch of lines here, so let me just remind myself which one I care about. I don't care about you or you. The rest of these are no good. Okay. So now I get into a situation where I need to mark out the opposite two edges of what will be a mortise. And so there's a couple ways I could do this. I can use my square and I can measure this out and make sure that this is where I want it to go. And then I could use my marking knife and follow that and kind of carry it through. Sometimes with a shorter square, this is a little bit trickier to find, and especially if the grain starts dictating where this knife is cutting, which it can do, it can start to pull your square away from the board. So this way works well, but I don't know if it's perfect or ideal. Slightly better option is to use a larger square, and then I can transfer or carry these lines over. Same concept, back of the knife, carrying this thing over, and that works. I think a better option for making a parallel line for a mortise to these edges would be would be to use a marking gauge. So this is one style of a marking gauge. Got this large reference or surface area to reference onto whatever it's going to dictate or create parallel lines to. Where it actually scores the line is a very small round cutter, and these are replaceable, thus the little screw head that you see. And to do that, I'm going to go outside of my mortise area, but let's say I just lock this into place. I would obviously measure, but just to show what this thing looks like, I can score a line there, and that becomes easy for me to transfer. Just a quick conversation about different styles of these. I've got two examples. This is a pretty straightforward one made by a manufacturer that we all know, and it's good, and I've had this one for years. I've bought a bunch of replacement blades. Do not be tempted to sharpen these. I would just go with the replacement cutters. Word to the wise, if you do buy replacement cutters, two things. You're going to spend, I don't know what these things are, maybe $2 for one of the cutters, maybe less, maybe a little bit more. But it's going to cost you $8 in shipping to get that to you. So I would recommend buying a bunch of these things to make shipping worth it. The other thing is I would make a note somewhere about where you're going to store these things, because they come in a tiny little manila envelope and they always get lost. So try to help yourself out for where these things are to be found. The other thing about this style, which I'm not crazy about, is that you'll notice that there's this round or pan head screw at the end of where the cutter is. And that's okay when you're doing marks like I just showed. Where I think a different style of marking gauge works much better is when that wheel is totally in line with the end of this rod. In other words, there's no protrusion out of the end. And so if I were to match up the thickness of this board, and I need to carry that over to another piece of material, I can just lay that guard on and could drop this rod into place and lock these two into position, and now I have a perfect match for this thickness, and I don't have to measure anything. It's pretty straightforward, pretty much laid out for me. The other thing that's nice about this style is I can loosen up one of these knobs, and there's a micro adjust here that decreases or increases the distance between your guide and where that cutter is. Once I'm happy with where that's at, I just lock this in, and anyway, I really am fond of the speed and accuracy that this style affords. All right, so let's lay out a mortise. Alright, so I already have the top and the bottom of this mortise. Now I need to create the width. Alright, so let's say I want to go dead center in this board. That's 5, 9, so that's 2 7 8, that's about right. 2 7 8, perfect. Okay, so I've created the center line here from these two edges. And then from there, I want to calculate out to my left and right what the overall dimension of this mortise is going to be. For the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to make this 1/2 inch. So come over to the left, 1/4 of an inch, to the right, 1/4 of an inch. That will equal a 1/2 inch. And if you notice, I made these lines outside of the field of where my mortise is going to go, because I don't want to confuse any of those lines when I'm cutting or laying these things out. Alright, so what I've done here is I dropped that cutter right on my line, and then I brought the stop, then I brought this stop into the edge, lock these things down. So from there, carry this through. Looks pretty great. I also want to mark the back, again using the same reference edge to carry these over. And for both of our sakes, one that you can see, me that I can see, so when I know where I cut when I need to cut. So now the choice I have to make now is that if I'm going to make this dead center in this board, it'd be very easy for me to just flip this over and then start scoring these things. And in reality, I'm probably okay with doing that. If I'm unsure about these parallel edges, once again, then I would be really tempted to not use this secondary edge to make that line. If I want this mortise to have parallel edges, that forces me to just use my one reference. Again, I've marked these things out so there's no confusion. So by doing that, I can make a little line here. That looks pretty good. Before I carry that line all the way through the mortise, I do want to get a double check on my measurements. They're close, but I want to tweak that just a bit. Nope, that's way too much. And oops. Alright, that's right on the money. Okay, so same reference edge. Now drawing in that second line, flipping over to the other face. And I should also mention, if you've got multiple joints that you're laying out, I'd be very tempted to make all of the lines that are set on this gauge. Mark all of those out first before, so I do all of these lines, this board, the next board, two other boards, whatever, before I would start measuring and marking off that secondary line. Alright, once I've got this, I know this is where my mortise goes, then it's probably a good habit to get into to start marking out this waist area. Once I've done that, that prepares me for going to the next tool, which is going to be, well, how to clear out this waist. Hey, just as an aside, a lot of people, and I failed to mention this as far as a marking tool, a lot of people use something like a scratch awl here, and they can do that. Same format, just dragging this across, and that will make a line, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just not nearly as accurate as the lines that you get when you actually cut those fibers across. With this one, it's just a round point, almost like a nail in a lot of ways, and it just kind of scoops out or digs in the center line there, and so I fear you're just not going to get as accurate of a cut. But I want to point it out because a lot of people are unaware on their squares that they should come with an awl on the end of this, which you'll never use now, but you'll know it's there. Unless you drop your square, which is never a good practice, please don't do that. But I have a scratch awl here for my larger square that I've lost because it no longer fits accurately. So hopefully that was helpful, and in laying out your work. Again, accuracy is so easily overlooked at the beginning, and it's so hard to correct for down the road. And if you're trying to correct for inaccurate layout with accurate cuts, you're just kind of going down a bad path of not being able to find exactly where it is you need to cut and when. So I'm going to show the drill press as far as cleaning this one up, and then back to the bench for chisel work. Thanks.